How did a wounded British Tommy get evacuated from the Battle of Mons of 1914? August the 23rd, 1914. The British Expeditionary Force is fighting its first major battle of the Great War along the Mons-Condé Canal in southern Belgium. For the men behind the canal banks, this is a shock. Modern rifles, machine guns and artillery, and casualties on a scale the British Army has not faced in generations. But what actually happened to a wounded British soldier, a Tommy, once he was hit at Mons? How did he get away from the canal bank to safety, if he got there at all? And crucially, because this series is about the unsung work of military medicine, what role did the field ambulances of the Royal Army Medical Corps play in that journey? By August 1914, the British Army had a medical system that looked robust on paper. Each division was supported by 3 field ambulances, each capable of breaking down into sections. For more detail on their structure, see the previous video. But on this day, their role would be collecting wounded from the battlefield, running dressing stations, and evacuating casualties from the battlefield. But at Mons there was a problem. Most of the field ambulances were not where they needed to be. Some were still detraining from railways. Others were marching, sometimes 30 miles or more, trying to catch up with divisions already in contact with the enemy. On the day of the battle itself, the 3rd Division had only one of its field ambulances available, and that was number 7 Field Ambulance. The 5th Division also only had one of the 3 field ambulances available, in that case number 13 Field Ambulances. Others were lost in transit, misdirected, or simply too far away. This matters because it shapes the fate of every wounded man. Imagine a British infantryman of the 8th or 9th Brigade holding the line near Nîmes or Jumats. He's hit, perhaps by shrapnel, perhaps by rifle fire. At this point, it's important to remember that battlefield medicine was very different from what we might think of nowadays. There's no morphine auto-injector to take away pain, there's no rapid helicopter evacuation, and also there was no forward surgical teams. So the injured man's survival depends on his own ability to move back, if he can. If he's unable to move himself, the regimental stretcher bearers, that's their role. But they would only move him back to the regimental aid post. From here, the field ambulance bearer sections are supposed to take the casualty back. And we should never forget that the tactical situation may not allow evacuation at all. So, at the Battle of Mons, under fire, wounded men are dragged or carried back, often to the nearest village, barn, school or house. Looking at the 3rd Division, which you'll remember had only the number 7 field ambulance available, its commanding officer did something crucial. He split the unit into its 3 independent sections, and each one of those sections covered a brigade, normally covered by a complete field ambulance. And each of those sections actually had to open up a dressing station. Now, one was in Tripoli, which was for the brigade that was being held in reverse. One was at Kuzmi, which was covering the canal fighting, and another one was at Huon, which is just south of Mons itself. It's important to remember these are not hospitals. According to the pre-war plans, that was further down the evacuation line. These were improvised aid posts, barns, schools, local buildings, places where bleeding could be controlled, wounds dressed, and men made just stable enough to move on. But then there's a key problem. There was no clear evacuation route established. No clearing hospitals, the next stage in the evacuation, no guarantee of ambulance columns, and there was no clear plans for rail instructions to evacuate people. Therefore, there was no certainty that wounded could be moved south before the retreat began. As British units began withdrawing from the canal line, reality set in. Some wounded could be moved, many could not. The limited ambulance wagons available filled quickly, as did any wagon with space on it. This horse transportation was very limited and had other demands upon its time. Shellfire was already reaching villages like Fromelles and Boussou, so the RAMC made a decision that haunts every retreat in military history. They left wounded behind, deliberately, often in civilian hospitals. British wounded soldiers were handed over to Belgian Red Cross hospitals. They were co-located into local schools and civic buildings, and in some cases even left in private chateaux or homes. This was done under the protection of the Geneva Convention, and in most cases this worked with some care and humanity, but it did mean captivity. One of the most powerful accounts of this action or type of action comes from a medical officer of number Field Ambulance, Lieutenant Hamilton. He was tasked to collect a wounded officer of the Gordon Highlanders and set off with 2 men to complete this task. But when he arrived at the building in question, the chateau in question, he found there was actually 50 wounded men. So sending these 2 bearers off to get help, he began treating the wounded at this chateau until German troops arrived. When they arrived, he tried to escape, but he was fired upon. So he returned back to the chateau and stayed. And soon he was actually caring for over 100 wounded, both British and German. And for 2 weeks he continued this tasking. He dressed wounds, he reported which men could walk, and in this case he was working with German medical facilities, and he was able to identify who would need surgery and send them off for surgery at local hospitals or in the German medical chain of evacuation. And remarkably, at least at this early stage of the war, the wounded were treated properly. The Geneva Convention was holding. Not all wounded were abandoned. Where access existed, particularly for the 5th Division, wounded men were evacuated, many of them being loaded onto passenger trains and being sent south towards Amiens. In these cases, officers of the Royal Medical Corps, who were all doctors, and medical personnel, often called orderlies, would normally accompany the train as it evacuated people. And in one extraordinary moment, a British medical officer managed to find a locomotive and carriages, and sent it forward under fire to retrieve wounded stranded at a canal station. Now, this was medical improvisation under pressure, logistics driven by necessity, not by doctrine. So how did a wounded British Tommy get evacuated from Mons? Well, the honest answer is there was no single system. Some made their own way, literally, the walking wounded. Some were carried by hand by the regimental stretcher bearers or by the bearers from the field ambulance. Many were treated in village schools. Some were evacuated by train. Some were left behind to become prisoners, and some had died where they fell. What Mons shows us is not failure, but transition. The British Army entered the war with a medical system designed for short, mobile campaigns. Mons showed that the industrial war would overwhelm it immediately. And yet, despite confusion, exhaustion, and retreat, the field ambulances adapted. They split, they improvised, and they sacrificed themselves by staying behind with the wounded when required. That ethos, that the wounded come first, would define the Royal Army Medical Corps for the rest of the war. In the next episode of this series, we'll follow how field ambulances adapted during the rest of 1914, how casualty clearing stations emerged, and how the medical chain of evacuation evolved into something recognisably modern. Because if you want to understand how armies survived the war, you have to follow the wounded.